Boardroom Bound, episode 170, Why It Is Essential to Start Your Board Career Now, with Fiona Hathorn.
You were going to find it really hard to sell yourself onto competitive paid boards against people who have had board experience, who understand their board value add. And I can tell you, my board value add was investment management oversight, but actually really it was something else altogether. And it wasn't until I sat on a board I'd realised what my transferable skill really was.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry, and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Fiona Hathorn, and she is the CEO of Women on Boards UK. This is an organization that's been around almost a decade, and they've supported over 2,000 people with success stories of getting onto boards. But they actually think there's about 4,000. They just only have the 2,000 success stories because everybody tells them about their great success. And it's not just women, it's men too. Clearly, lots of great information to share about how you can be successful in your board journey. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about board director education and certification. Want to join your first board or looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Education and Certification course. Get both the Modern Board Director Candidate Packaging and Modern Board Operations Knowledge integrated with one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency designation upon course completion, available in one-on-one, group, or on-demand registration options. You can learn more at bit.ly, that's bit.ly/IBDC-D. So bit.ly/IBDC-D. And now, let's jump into the show. Fiona Hathorn, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Looking forward to it enormously, Alexander.
Well, for me, this is great fun because I've been following the great work that you guys have been doing over Women on Boards UK for a while, and I think our audience is going to be really surprised because despite maybe what the title says, you don't only help women, there's also men, but there's clearly lots of great advice and topics and thoughts that's going to be relevant for all of our audience. But before I begin peeling back the layers about how all of this started and how it worked, let's begin with your career trajectory and experience, right? Because you've got a lot of qualifications that put you in this seat so you can do the great work that you do. So let's start there.
Sure. My background, my first graduate job was actually as a trainee accountant for PwC, known as Pricewaterhouse then. I thought I needed a professional qualification. Sometimes minorities, male or female, feel that they need a qualification. I felt I needed a chartered accountant certificate to get into the City of London, which was really interesting when I joined in 1986. Because the City of London was going sort of digital. You no longer had the old-fashioned jobbers and brokers chatting to each other, passing information. It was going digital and it was going electronic. So I joined the city around that time. When luck plays a part in life, doesn't it? I met a headhunter at a party who certainly wasn't headhunting graduates, but he told me about a fund management company called Hill Samuel that were looking for trainee fund managers. And I followed up after that party. And what was really funny is the headhunter couldn't even remember me. He was quite drunk at the time. But he couldn't dispute the conversation that we had. And he introduced me to Hill Samuel. So I joined their graduate program. And my first desk as a fund manager was the Japanese desk. And again, very, very lucky because most of the other graduates wanted to be doing US equities or UK stocks and shares. And I said, well, I'll just go where there's a space. And in the 1990s, you had negative real interest rates and an explosion in emerging markets. So I became a very young head of desk in a really interesting growing area. And I know we wanted to talk about the boardroom. I thought I knew and understood the boardroom. Because when you are buying and selling shares on behalf of your clients, you're meeting directors, you're meeting chairs. But actually, when you sit on the other side of the table and you're personally liable for this company, this organization, it is very different. So I got interested in the board space when I joined the board of an investment trust and also a charity, a medical research charity. And then I realized that actually it was fantastic to stretch yourself into governance and strategy from a different perspective, and we can talk about that later. I launched Women on Boards purely because I hadn't realized how few women were on boards 10 years ago. The UK at the time, our big FTSE 100 companies only had 12% in terms of gender diversity on boards. And I was horrified. And I realized, and we can get down into the nuts and bolts of this later, I realized that there's nothing gender specific about the boardroom. It just so happened that there weren't many women in the boardroom. So I believe you're never too young to be on a board, as long as you understand your duties, responsibilities, and liabilities. And Women on Boards UK was set up purely to support people, explaining that being on a board is not rocket science. You don't need to be an expert, but you do need to understand your board value add, and you need to understand your liabilities and how you can better shape an organisation for its future.
Fiona, that was well said, and maybe we'll start there. You talked about your first couple board roles. One of them was in a nonprofit experience, and what I've found is a lot of, I'll look back at your experience, a high flyer, let's say in the financial service industry, business world, who's doing great things and things. I want to give back. I want to be responsible to society around me and help maybe in the passion projects that I would love to be involved in, and they can give a certain amount of hours volunteering through direct service, or to think, you know what, I can leverage this up and have a higher return on my investment with a charity. The few hours a month that I could give, say, being on their board and helping maybe rethink how they do their investments or helping with their strategy, because I know business plans, versus actually just sort of being in the food kitchen, which there's nothing wrong with. But you need that background, that experience. And for many people, it's a great starting point. It sounds like it was for you. I would love to hear your thoughts, because there are other people who say, no, never give away your time. You want to be in a compensated board role, but for some people, it's where you start and how you grow and develop. How do you help people think through the different options about how they begin this board journey?
Sure. I mean, I call it the 7 reasons why being on a board is good for you, your company, i.e. your employer at the time, and society. And just very briefly, the 7 reasons are: it creates a point of difference on your CV. So, if you're going up for promotion, but you're able to talk at the leadership perspective, from a governance perspective, your bosses are likely to be more interested in you. The thing that it did for me, the second reason, is it really built my market and industry knowledge into a different area, and showed everyone in the company how ambitious I was. Career resilience is another really interesting one. If you take a career break, and women in general tend to take more career breaks because still in most cases women are giving birth from time to time, it's a great thing to do if you take a career break, because it fills your skills gap and maybe your confidence gap. But there are many other things, like exposure to executives in other organizations. When I joined the board of Fight for Sight, a medical research charity, I was sitting next to a really senior leader from JP Morgan. I was also sitting next to the chairman of one of our largest banks. Fascinating to watch them in operation. It also enables you to give something back to the community about something you're passionate about. Yes, money matters, but most charitable foundations cannot legally pay you. And charities are a really, really important part of our society, particularly in America, I would say, as well. And also, it allows you to explore what it's like to be a non-executive director, and does it suit you? Being on the board is not for everyone. And if you retire to maybe be a portfolio individual, because it's not all about being on boards, you are going to find it really hard to sell yourself onto competitive paid boards against people who have had board experience, who understand their board value add. And I can tell you, my board value add was investment management oversight. But actually, really, it was something else altogether. And it wasn't until I sat on a board I'd realize what my transferable skill really was.
Well, those are fascinating ideas, and I love them. I want to circle back to some, but when I think about your organization at a high level, right? So if I try to encapsulate Women on Boards UK and someone looking at it from the outside, they'd go, wow, Fiona really gets us, understands this, because you've supported, 9.5 years, something like 1,800 people, something like that, to land board seats, which is really an incredible number. And I'm sure in many ways it's allowed you to distill down, just like you said there, that sort of 7 principles and the ideas. And I imagine there's different ways that people approach you. And I'd love your thoughts on this. I'm sure some say, Fiona, I've decided I want to be on a board. You help me do that, which is sort of like saying, like, get me a job. Like, I don't even know how to think about that. Like, it's so broad. When you have those situations, someone going, I've decided I want to start down this path, which is a very beginning decision to have there. How do you help them begin to think through what they should do and how they should do it and when they should do it?
Well, the first thing is, we advertise board vacancies for free. So my organisation has, in the UK and globally, we've got a sister operation in Australia. We've advertised over 50,000 board roles for free. So anybody who joins Women on Boards UK, for example, can have access to 400 available board seats today, 50 new ones a week. So the first thing I would say is have a look at a vacancy board in the non-exec space so that you're aware of what's out there, because you only know what you know. So that's really, really important, is being aware of the landscape of the boardroom. The second thing that you're going to need is understand governance structures and the role of the board. Now, a lot of people think, well, I need to go on a certificated course. I need to read everything about governance, the regulator. Most people learn on the job. Most boards, you and I know, still don't transparently advertise. We talk about diversity in the boardroom, diversity of people and thought, but we're petrified of people we don't know. So once you've seen what's out there, you need to have a board CV. And one of the things my organisation does, and that's why we work with so many different countries, is we have a CV course in the cloud, which is free to anybody who becomes a member of our network, that takes them through why a board CV is completely different from an executive CV. And then the final part is, once you understand a little bit about governance and crucially who your regulator is. And most regulators have what I call idiot guide websites that explain your duties, responsibilities, and liabilities. So it's not difficult. It's then to make sure the person can sell their board value add. Because I know you meet a lot of executives who are interested in the boardroom. I'm not interested in their executive day job. I'm interested in their transferable board skills. Boards actually only do 2 things: performance, strategy and stargazing, and conformance, governance and abiding by the law and filing your accounts, risk registers, all that sort of thing. And when you join a board, if it's a good board, even if it's a charitable foundation, you often have a skills audit. And understanding where you sit and what seat you're taking around the table is really important. So that's what we specialise in, making it simple, because most people learn on the job, and being a good board director is common sense. We can talk later about the role of the chair and also the real dynamics of the boardroom, because actually it's people. And people make effective boards. You can have the best board directors, but if they don't work together collectively and understand their role, you've got a problem. So the first, most crucial point is, do you really understand what you're getting into, and can you confidently sell your board value add when you are questioned? Because as a minority, male or female, i.e. those people who don't currently know the existing board directors, as far as I'm concerned, are a minority, you're going to have to be really an effective communicator at selling you.
And Fiona, you've made so many great points there. I want to bring home 2 for our audience, and let's draw this out almost on 2 ends of the spectrum, if we call it sort of age-based. I think you made a great point that you're never too young to join a board or too old. Although I'll caveat the part about too old, because you talked about retirement before, and there's some people that do view, I've got my executive day job and that's really full time, and when that finishes, I will transition to the next spot in my life. That can be a very hard transition, whether you've even if you've had some nonprofit board experience. If you're now moving to land, say, only compensated board roles, ideally to build a portfolio, which is how some people think about it, that is a big uphill battle. There are some people that have amazing networks and they can make it happen right away, but I'm sure you've encountered some people that are thinking that and maybe have already said, I'm retired and now I'm ready to go, and haven't necessarily laid the groundwork. If you're that sort of situation, you've got a really impressive executive CV, not a board CV, right? But you've got that background experience. What's the guidance and advice you give to someone in that scenario?
Well, I think the first thing is you need to tell people you're interested in board roles, everyone. And you don't always have to market yourself. You can just say to your neighbour, your friend, your family, previous executives, oh, I notice you're on XYZ board. Fascinating. Do tell me how it works and how does it operate. You can suck up information all of the time. And in talking about you're never too young and you're never too old, clearly age and wisdom matters, but you need to understand what wisdom you have and how you're going to better shape an organization. And the more you talk to your network, the more you draw out things that you didn't realize that you had to offer. And you're subliminally, not even subliminally, very obviously telling somebody that you meet that you're potentially interested in board roles. And I think that's absolutely crucial because we've had thousands of success stories. I mean, it's 2.5, 3, 4,000 success stories. We know 2.5 in terms of who've told us they've got a board position. And many of them have actually sourced their own board positions, but we've also made them robust and resilient because most of the executives that you and I are talking about have never had rejection in their lives. When you get down to the final two in a board interview, it's about fit. Do we think we can work with this person? And it's usually you're all good enough at that stage. So it is about being an effective an interview as well. And you're absolutely right. The earlier that you have that board experience, the more likely you're going to have success, which is why I want to talk to people on this call, men as well as women, to say, have you thought about board roles when you're at university? And think of committees, societies, anything you can get your hands on that is running tiny little budgets, putting strategies together, and where you're shaping an organization. Because it's those people, and we know if we look at the Fortune 500 companies, it's the individuals who get to the top have usually had exposure to the boardroom before the age of 28. And I can talk to you about back empowerment and leveling up, giving people the knowledge of the boardroom, and I call it planting seeds. You and I are doing this today. We're germinating and we're planting seeds. We don't know who's going to listen to this podcast, but what we do want to make sure is when they're interested, they know that somebody on their side. So, Women on Boards UK is a tribe. Join us. We'll help you. We support. You can be as vulnerable as you like so that we make sure that when you do get for an interview or you do meet a headhunter, you show the best of yourself to maximize your chances. And we can talk later about making sure you get the right board for you. Because you need to do the interviewing as well. This is not an executive job. It's a non-exec trustee governor position.
Well, Fiona, you're actually reading my mind. I think that's exactly where I'd like to go next in terms of, I'll call the due diligence for our audience, right? So I would agree with you. By the time you get to the finalists, whether it's 2, 3, or 4, you're all perfect basically on paper with the spec. And the board's trying to figure out who is the right person for me. And the analogy I like to use is dating. And dating is a two-way street. And both sides want to make sure this is a good fit for us. And I guess I would argue it's really high risk for the board person who's a prospective trying to land their first board seat. You want to build a strong portfolio. You want to be successful. And your name will grow and develop in good or bad ways depending on that board seat. But it is so hard for someone the first time to understand due diligence, especially if it's a private organization where a lot of the information is as inaccessible as, say, a public company. So what's the sort of guidance and thoughts that you give to someone thinking about, I've got to go through this board due diligence, which is so important?
Yeah, when we meet board directors who are joining large, public boards, so those could be government-related boards or large companies, you will be up against executives who spent days looking at the finances of an organization. And if the company is, or the organization, you can't get hold of their finances, most websites you will find a governance area and you'll see their profit and loss and your balance sheet. If you can't get hold of that, ask them for it. It's not an unreasonable question. You want me to come for an interview? Please, will you share with me something about your organization? So that's the fine thing, is understand the finances. Because the key thing about being on a board is in most countries around the world, trading when you know you can't pay your bills is something called fraud. And you have to be really careful with insolvency with organizations. So I'd want to join a board that was solvent, not insolvent. And if it was in financial difficulty, because organizations do get into financial difficulty, I would want to know I was comfortable being a turnaround agent. The next thing I'd want to look at is who are the other board members. I want to understand a little bit about the executive team. Do I like them? Are we about to replace the executive team? And crucially, the role of the chair. because the chair is the one with the real power. And the interaction, because they're controlling the agenda, the dynamics of the boardroom. And if I would want to know the chair and the chief exec, or whatever the title is, there was a good relationship of trust. And I think when you're going into the interview, making sure you like them, the other people you're going to be collectively, you're all collectively responsible for what's going on in this organization. You won't agree with everything that's going on, and are you comfortable with the skills audit around the table? So it's very much about you doing your due diligence, because most of us have taken a long time to build up our brand and reputation, and this is not a time to be flattered that somebody's offered us a nice, a theatre board, an arts board or something. I'd want to know a little bit more. And that's why on our website we've got a resource centre with all the questions out there for you of the due diligence you need to do. Because, it is nerve-wracking at interviews, and it's crucial that you show that you do understand that this is a two-way process.
And it's really interesting if you are, we've talked about this scenario before, someone who's a high-powered executive is now thinking, I want to move into board roles. Maybe it's one where you're dipping your toe in before you retire, or you retire and you want a whole portfolio. It is really hard to go from that sort of nose in, fingers out. That is a big change from being the person who understands it and lives in the business to instead popping in, whether it's monthly or quarterly, whatever your frequency is, and then doing a very quick deep dive into it, asking the right questions, because as a board member, you're not doing anymore. You're really coaching, you're guiding, you're advising, maybe calling upon the industry expertise that you bring. That's a big change. I'm sure you've experienced some people where you've helped them land that first board seat, but they've had difficulty. It's just a learning curve, right? Which is part of the fun of doing something different. How do you help people go through that process?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that lots of chief executives don't make very good first-time board directors. It takes them a long time to actually calm down, because normally as a chief exec you can control, you can change, you can move budgets around, resources, you can get things done. Much harder to do as a non-exec. You don't meet very often, and you just have to be comfortable with that. And that's why our organisation, Women on Boards UK and also Australia, work with so many corporates. We go into organisations like Fidelity, BlackRock, Visa, JP Morgan, to plant those board seeds early and to say, I know you think you need to heads down and get noticed in your organisation, but actually most people that get on are influencing, understand stakeholders, and they've got a different sense of self, and by going on boards, it enables you to do that. And chief executives or senior individuals who might be feeling vulnerable at the point they retire, and we see a lot of retiring partners from accountancy firms who've just not been out there. They actually don't have a particularly great sense of the world. A lot of people in financial services don't, because they're almost little clones of themselves. And that's why it's important to get exposure earlier on, because that transition you're pointing out is important. And if you see the perfect board role for you, you want to be your perfect board self when you get there, and that's hard to do if you haven't had board experience before. Hence why most organisations are beginning to realise that they need to lend their talent into the community to create a better world, and that will really benefit those retiring partners, because they are so vulnerable when they're at a point of what is a huge change for them in terms of their life.
And it's really interesting because when we think about interviewing, let's say, for an executive job, we all get that it doesn't have anything to do with us about the hiring manager on the other side of the table. We need to tell our stories in language that works for them. But take the example you had of someone who services a board, whether it's a lawyer, accountant, or others, who has been in the boardroom for a long time, worked at the board, probably feels like their credentials should speak for themselves and people should just open the doors and let them in because they're going to need them. But the same point, you are doing that interview. You have to translate what you've done, but now it's such a different way of translating that across. And maybe this is a good transition point to really talk about the board chair. And I don't think we talk about it enough on this show. It is an incredibly important role. It's very hard to be good at it. It's a very different experience than just being a good board member. There's an evolution through that. And I would say not all board members make good chairs, but maybe we can elaborate on what actually makes a good chair. And people probably need this in mind as part of the interview process. We hinted about that before. You needed to know the chair and the CEO and their relationship and how the organization runs, make sure you're comfortable. But we should really spend some time saying what makes a good chair so people can realize what that means and feels like.
Yeah, and I also want to pick up in terms of the interview process before we talk about the chair role because we work with a lot of corporates. You tend to find that men don't come to our organisation to become a member to get our support because of our brand name. It slightly puts men off. That's not our intention, but we do want a comfortable brand that women in particular can come to. But because of our corporate work, I speak to a lot of very, very senior men who tell me it's not fair, it's going to be very difficult for me to get a board role. I'm not an ethnic minority, I'm not a woman. And I just laugh and say, Nick, don't make me laugh. I said, you are going to find it very easy. You're very connected, you're a senior leader, you're very well recognised. But the reality now is that most boards are going through a skills audit, and even if your friend has put you forward and you've got the shortlist, when you get there, you're still going to be interviewed. Whereas I think historically people were just placed on boards. And I think that's the good news, that things are different. But just moving on to the chair question, INSEAD did some very, very interesting research on what makes a good chair. So they surveyed hundreds of board chairs across 31 different countries with masses of interviews and found out some really fascinating things. So, for example, a good chair speaks for less than 10% of the time. Because a good chair, and they came up with 8 principles, is a guide on the side. They're putting together agendas. They're speaking to the stakeholders before the meetings. They're building up those relationships. They're making sure the board sees problems and discusses quite serious high-level things and doesn't get down into the details. So the chair is absolutely crucial because the chair ought to be measuring inputs, not outputs. Because you can't get everything right in the board, but if you don't have the right inputs to make decisions, then you're not going to get good outputs in the long term, and the outputs would be the performance. And lots of chairs, a good chair does not try and be the boss. And of course, that's again where the chief executive sometimes falls over.
And it's interesting because in the U.S., more than other places in the world, we still have this, I'll call it a dilemma, of where a CEO is also a chair. And I would argue they're very different skill sets. It's probably hard to do one without impacting the other in a negative way, right? In theory, the chair is there to do different things that the CEO reports into. And there are some other roles that are high profile. I used to work at JP Morgan. Jamie Dimon is the best banker of his generation. He's the chairman and the CEO. I'd love your thoughts on this we talked before about that relationship from the chair and the CEO and understanding how they work. What are your thoughts for someone thinking about joining an organization? Does it tell them something if the chair and the CEO are combined?
I think you're absolutely right. Being a chair calls for very specific skills and practices. One of which is practice teaming, not being a team, whereas a chief executive has a team under him or her that's reporting into them. Whereas boards, you don't meet very often. So you've got to work together, but you're not a team in the same sense. But I think you're right. Best governance practice is to have an independent chief executive and an independent chair. Very, very difficult. I meet a lot of companies where the chief exec moves on to be the chair and then the new chief exec comes in. You imagine operating as a new chief exec when the previous chief exec is sitting above you. It's a very, very difficult dynamics. And also, a good chair is a representative for the shareholders and stakeholders. They're not meant to be a player. Whereas if you are both the chair and the chief executive, you're defending your strategy. You're defending your latest mergers and acquisition. You're defending, if you get an aggressive investor on your board that's challenging your strategy, who is going to properly listen to that individual as an independent? The chair should start that conversation. So I think it's extremely difficult when the chair and the chief executive are one in the same person. Whereas I think we've got a slightly different regulatory structure. And of course, in Europe, you've often got supervisory boards, which are different again. So I think it really, really matters. And if you look at all the case studies, if you look at the history of Hewlett-Packard, the history of ownership of Hewlett-Packard, the chair being the same as the chief executive, there's a whole series of dynamics in the 1990s and 2000 which made that organisation very, very difficult for them to function. And I think that joint responsibility between the chair and chief executive is one of those reasons.
So Fiona, when you look backwards, right? So it's been about 9.5 years since you launched Women on Boards UK. I'd love to wrap up this today to say, like, clearly there's been a lot of success, right? Placing 1,800 plus, whatever the large number of people onto boards, some of which you said you don't even know. It's even bigger than that. Those are the case studies that you have. You thought it was maybe 4,000. When you look forward for the next decade, like, where do you think the organization is going to grow and develop?
I'm super proud of what we've achieved. If people say, if I think about my executive career, it was one thing. I think the key for us now is we're now running a business. It started off as a movement, a support network. And if you're going to scale it, and what we're doing is on scale, I describe we're mass market and bespoke at the point that you need us. We are getting a lot of calls from teams in Canada, from teams in Singapore, from teams in Japan, from teams in Africa saying, we need your organization in our country. And I often say, we can help you. We can give you the website and the platform because there's a lot of cost involved in that. We can even give you the tools that you need to run it. But I do say to people, are you going to give up your day job to run this network? Because we are not a happy, clappy organization running this on the side of our day jobs. We've given up our highly paid jobs. We can now afford to pay ourselves, but this is full-time. And what investment are you going to put in to make sure this is successful? And I find too many minority networks, women's networks and other minority networks are run by passionate people alongside their day job. So I think that's our challenge. How do we scale this to have the real impact globally? Because it's very much needed. There's a huge number of bespoke board support networks around the world, but they're expensive. And I want to empower everyone and level up. And I know this board knowledge that we have within our network, we need to share it at scale. Hence why we work with so many corporates. So that's my challenge going forward, and I think it's an extremely exciting challenge to have.
Well, Fiona, thank you for sharing your journey with Women on Boards UK with us today. And we're delighted to have you on the show. And the great work that you're doing is really making a difference. And you can see that by all the success you're having. So thank you for sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound.
Thank you. You're very welcome.
That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Fiona Hathorn. It was great hearing about all the success that Women on Boards UK is having, and clearly a really important topic they're trying to tackle, but takeaways for all of us about the things that we need to do, not only to prepare ourselves to be successful on the board, but then ensure we're set up for success once we have landed that board seat. And remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you'll find links to all of today's resources. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you don't miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.